There is a county in western Nebraska where certain summers stay with people longer than they should. Not because the weather was unusual, though. The summer of 1996 brought heat that settled into the soil and did not leave for weeks. Not because of prices or politics or the 100 ordinary things that fill a farming life, but because of what happened at Lander Creek on the morning of July 17th, and because of what came before it, and because of a man named Harlan Dern who drove a 1921 K-Steam traction engine down a county road at 4 miles an hour and did not say a single word to anyone who stopped to watch him go. To understand what happened at Lander Creek, you have to understand Harlan Dern. And to understand Harlan Dern, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of that July morning, but the beginning of a man and a machine that had been together so long they had become a single thing. And you cannot understand what a single thing does without knowing where it came from. Harlan Dern was born in 1922 in Kimball County, Nebraska, the only son of a wheat farmer named Curtis Dern, who had broken his quarter section from raw prairie in 1906. With a team of horses and a determination that his neighbors described, depending on how well they knew him, as either admirable or slightly frightening. The land was flat and open and productive when the rain came and merciless when it did not. In the 1920s, the rain came often enough. In the 1930s, it stopped coming the way it used to, and what came instead was wind, and what the wind carried was the topsoil that Curtis had spent 30 years building, blowing south toward Kansas in brown curtains that turned noon into dusk and left a grit between your teeth that no amount of water could fully wash away. Harlan grew up in this dust bowl the way children grow up in any catastrophe when they are too young to understand the scale of it. It was simply the world. Brown sky was the sky. Grit in your teeth was the taste of morning. The particular low mood that settled over adults during those years was the weather of childhood, something you moved through without knowing it had a name. What Harlan did understand even then was that some families survived and some did not, and the difference was not always luck. Curtis Dern survived because he owned his equipment outright, because he kept his debt as close to zero as the harvest allowed, and because he could fix everything himself. Every piece of machinery on the Dern farm could be diagnosed, disassembled, repaired, and returned to service by Curtis alone in the shop behind the equipment barn, with the tools hanging on their outlines on the pegboard wall and the parts organized in coffee cans by size and type on the shelves above the workbench. Curtis had a saying that Harlan heard so many times during those years that it stopped being a saying and became something closer to a physical law, something as inarguable as the weight of things or the direction of water. He said, "A machine you can fix is a machine you own. A machine you cannot fix owns you." He said it when neighbors lost equipment to repair bills they could not pay. He said it when the county agent came around talking about new credit programs and updated machinery. He said it quietly and without judgment, the way a man states something he has tested against enough hard experience that he no longer feels the need to defend it. In 1933, when Harlan was 11 years old, Curtis bought a used K-Steam traction engine from a neighbor named Aldous Greer, who had farmed the section to the south since before Harlan was born. Aldous was leaving farming. His eyes had gone bad over the previous 2 winters, the kind of slow deterioration that a man argues with for years before he admits what it means, and what it meant for Aldous was that he could no longer safely manage a live steam boiler. A boiler at working pressure required a man who could read gauges clearly and feel fittings with precision and catch the small signs that preceded the large problems. Aldous could no longer do those things reliably, and he was honest enough with himself to know it. The Case had been built in Racine, Wisconsin in 1921 by the J.I. Case Threshing Machine Company. Aldous had bought it new that year and had run it for 12 seasons, threshing wheat and pulling stumps and doing the heavy work that horses could not manage, and that the early gasoline tractors of the era were not powerful enough to handle. It was in 1933, 12 years old, and showing none of the deterioration that 12 years of hard agricultural work, might reasonably be expected to produce, because Aldous Greer had maintained it with the same careful attention that Curtis Dern brought to everything mechanical, which was the careful attention of a man who understood that a machine properly cared for will outlast every prediction made about it. Aldous wanted $300. Curtis paid $280 in cash from the harvest account and drove the machine home across 5 miles of county road, the exhaust chuffing steadily in the autumn air, the steel wheels ringing on the gravel at 4 miles an hour. There was no faster speed, there was no need for one. Harlan was standing at the farm gate when his father came home with it. He remembered that moment for the rest of his life. Not because it was dramatic, though there was something in the scale of the machine, the sheer physical presence of 22,000 pounds of steel and copper and iron moving under its own power that was difficult to look at without feeling something shift in your understanding of what was possible. He remembered it because of what he felt in that moment, which was not excitement exactly, though excitement was part of it. What he felt was recognition, as if something he had been waiting for, without knowing he was waiting for it, had finally arrived. Curtis shut the machine down in the equipment yard and walked around it 3 times without speaking. Then he looked at Harlan and said, "Go get the maintenance manual from the cab." It was the beginning of an education that would last 63 years. What Harlan learned about the case in the years that followed was not the kind of learning that happens in classrooms or from books, though there were books, the maintenance manual and the parts catalog, and a collection of technical bulletins from the case company that Curtis had accumulated over the years and kept in a tin box on the shelf above the workbench. What Harlan learned came from being present, from watching and listening and asking questions when the silence had gone on long enough that a question seemed appropriate, and from understanding early that the best way to learn from a man like Curtis Dern was to keep your mouth quiet and your eyes open and let the work teach you what words could not fully convey. By 11, he could check the flues and read the water glass. By 13, he understood the valve timing and could feel by hand whether the admission valve was set correctly or had drifted from the adjustment. By 14, he was doing most of the routine maintenance himself with Curtis, watching from the doorway of the shop, drinking coffee and not saying anything, which was his way of indicating that the work was being done correctly. The case burned coal. In Kimball County in the 1930s, coal was not difficult to obtain and was not rationed and was not subject to the supply disruptions that would make gasoline a problem in the years that followed. When the war came and gasoline was allocated by ration book, the diesel tractors that Harlan's neighbors had invested in sat idle during planting and harvest because the fuel to run them could not be obtained in sufficient quantities. The case ran. Harlan was 19 years old in 1941 and farming his father's land because Curtis had developed a heart condition the previous winter that kept him out of the heavy work, and the only machinery on the Dern farm that operated without interruption through the war years was the machine that ran on coal and water and the accumulated knowledge of the 2 men who kept it. Harlan did not go to college. He had wanted to. He had done well enough in school that the agriculture teacher in Kimball had told Curtis that the boy had a mind worth investing in, which was the way educators spoke in 1939, when they meant that a student deserved more formal education than farming alone would provide. Curtis had listened without comment and thanked the teacher for his time. 6 months later, his heart gave its first serious warning, and the conversation about college was quietly set aside and never reopened. Harlan understood this without it ever being discussed. He was the son of a man who did not explain necessary things because necessary things did not require explanation. What stayed with him in the years that followed was not bitterness about the path he had not taken. He had made his peace with that before he was 25. What stayed with him was an awareness of how people with credentials looked at people without them, a particular quality of attention that was polite on the surface and dismissive underneath, and the knowledge that the only reliable answer to that kind of dismissal was work done correctly over time until the results made the credentials irrelevant. He had tested this knowledge repeatedly over the decades. He had been right about it every time. But being right did not make the dismissal easier to absorb. And there was one incident in particular that had changed the way Harlan Dern moved through the world quietly and permanently in a way that most people who knew him were not aware of, and that he himself thought about only occasionally when something reminded him of it. In the summer of 1978, a construction company out of Scottsbluff was running a drainage improvement project on the county road that passed the eastern boundary of the Dern farm. They were moving heavy equipment across a section of road that had developed a serious soft spot after the previous spring's flooding. The project supervisor, a compact and efficient man named Bud Skaggs, who wore his experience in the direct economy of his movements, had assessed the situation and concluded that the soft section was impassable for his heaviest equipment without first stabilizing the subgrade. Harlan had watched the operation from his fence line for 2 mornings before he walked over and introduced himself. He explained that he had a steam traction engine that had moved heavy loads across similar ground conditions several times over the years, and that the approach of sustained lateral force at low ground pressure might solve the problem without requiring the stabilization work, which would take time and materials that the project timeline might not accommodate. Skaggs had listened with the expression of a man who is being polite because politeness costs nothing. He had looked at the case parked in Harlan's equipment yard 50 yards away with the expression of a man encountering something from a county museum. He had thanked Harlan for the suggestion and returned to his crew without another word. 2 days later, Harlan heard the diesel crane from inside his house. He walked to the fence and watched the crane work the soft section for 4 hours before the crane itself began to settle into the ground that Skaggs had assessed as adequately firm for the outriggers. The crane company had to bring a second crane to extract the first. The project fell 3 weeks behind schedule. The cost overrun was substantial enough that Harlan heard about it at the grain elevator in Kimball the following month from 3 different people who told it as a story about the particular arrogance of outside contractors who did not understand Nebraska ground. Harlan listened to the story each time and did not say that he had offered an alternative. There was no point in saying it. The outcome had made the point without his help. But something shifted in him that summer, quietly and without drama, the way important things often shift in people of a certain temperament. He had offered his knowledge once and been declined in a way that had not required a single impolite word. He decided without consciously framing it as a decision that he would not offer again. If someone wanted what he knew and what the case could do, they would have to ask. He would answer when asked. He would not volunteer. It was not bitterness. Harlan Dern was not a bitter man. It was something more like economy. You spent your energy on the work, not on convincing people that the work was worth doing. If they needed to be convinced before they could see the evidence, they were not the kind of people the evidence would convince anyway. He farmed his land. He maintained the case. He ran it at the county fair every summer, the boiler fired, and the engine under load, because the fair committee asked him every year and he said yes, because the fair was a legitimate occasion and because running the case under load was the correct way to keep it right. He was called 3 times over the years by neighbors with equipment problems that conventional machinery could not solve. And each time he arrived, assessed the situation, rigged the case, and did the work without ceremony. Those neighbors knew what he had and they knew how to ask. That was all that was required. By 1996, Harlan Dern was 74 years old and the case was 75. Both of them still worked. Neither of them had any particular interest in proving anything to anyone. Now let me tell you about the other man at the center of this story, because this is not only Harlan's story, it is also the story of Dale Pruitt. And you need to understand Dale Pruitt before you can understand why the morning of July 17, 1996 unfolded the way it did. Dale Pruitt was 43 years old in the summer of 1996 and had been working in oil and gas drilling for 20 years, starting as a roughneck out of Casper, Wyoming at 23, and working his way through every level of field operations until he was running his own crews by 30 and managing multi-rig contracts by 35. He was compact and efficient in the way that serious field engineers tend to be his competence, visible not in what he said, but in how he moved through a work site, the way his eyes went to the relevant details without being directed there, the way decisions arrived fully formed without visible deliberation. He was good at his job in the specific and measurable way that means the job gets done correctly under conditions that cause other people's jobs to fall apart. He was good at reading ground. He was good at calculating axle loads on unpaved roads. He was good at choosing access routes through terrain that the maps described one way and the ground presented another. He had moved drilling rigs into places that the logistics people said could not be accessed, and out of places that the extraction people said could not be exited. And he had done this often enough that his professional reputation had a specific character to it, the reputation of a man you called when the standard approach had stopped working. In 1993, he had written a technical paper for the Society of Petroleum Engineers on the assessment of creek and river crossing sites for heavy equipment movement. The paper had addressed the specific problem of sites that presented as stable under dry conditions and became something else entirely when the water table rose or the substrate was disturbed. It had included a detailed protocol for evaluating the load-bearing capacity of creekbed sediments before committing heavy equipment to a crossing, a protocol that incorporated soil testing at multiple depths and multiple distances from the crossing center line. The paper had been well received. It was referenced in the training materials of 3 drilling companies that Dale knew of, and probably more that he did not. When younger engineers asked him what he was most professionally proud of, he sometimes mentioned it. He mentioned it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had solved a real problem in a rigorous way and put the solution where others could use it. On the morning of July 17, 1996, Dale Pruitt drove a 1991 National 65E truck-mounted drilling rig weighing 55 tons, fully rigged across the Lander Creek Ford on the county road that crossed the eastern boundary of the section he was working. He had driven lighter vehicles across that ford 20 times that summer. He had driven heavier vehicles across it twice. He had read the ford on each crossing with the quick professional assessment of a man who had developed good instincts for ground through 2 decades of moving heavy things across uncertain terrain. The ford had a gravel bottom. The water was 18 inches deep at summer low. The gravel appeared solid and the creek bed appeared stable. What Dale did not know and what his protocol had not detected because his earlier assessments had been made under different load conditions was that the gravel base at the Lander Creek Ford was approximately 8 inches deep over a layer of blue clay that was in the July heat with the water table at its summer high, saturated to a point where its load-bearing capacity was somewhere between minimal and theoretical. The rig made it 3/4 of the way across before the front axle broke through the gravel. The chassis settled, the suspension compensated as far as it could compensate, then the frame found the creek bed and the wheels found the clay beneath the gravel, and the clay held the wheels the way clay holds things completely and without negotiation. The rig sat at a 15-degree angle, nose slightly downstream frame on the creekbed wheels buried to the hubs going nowhere. Dale stood on the bank and looked at his rig for a long time. He had driven across that ford. He had applied his protocol. He had made the assessment that a man with his experience and his training and his published paper on the subject was qualified to make, and his rig was in the creek. The man who had written the definitive protocol for assessing creek crossings had put his rig into a creek. He did not spend much time on that irony because there was no time to spend on anything except the problem. in front of him. He called the drilling company in Cheyenne. He called the project operator. He called 2 crane companies, one in Kearney and one in Grand Island, and both sent representatives who came, assessed, and delivered the same conclusion through different words. The crane capable of lifting a 55-ton rig from a creek bed needed to deploy its outriggers on the bank. The bank was the same blue clay that had taken the rig. Any crane heavy enough to do the work would begin to sink before it could deploy. The county road to the site had an axle weight limit of 8 tons. The large cranes ran 16 tons per axle. The access road would fail before the crane reached position. Gus Elmhurst, the geotechnical engineer from the Kearney Crane Company, spent 3 hours taking soil samples and running load calculations before presenting Dale with a written report that was 3 pages long. The conclusion of the report was that recovery by mobile crane within the insurance window was not feasible, given current site conditions, without first stabilizing the bank with fill material, constructing a temporary access road capable of supporting the crane's axle loads, and waiting for the creekside soils to cure, a process estimated at a minimum of 3 weeks under optimal conditions. The insurance adjuster arrived on July 19th. He walked the site. He sat in his car for a long time reviewing his policy documents. Then he told Dale what insurance adjusters tell equipment operators when the math works out against recovery. The rig could be written off at replacement value minus depreciation, minus the deductible, minus the cost of extracting whatever components could be removed by hand. The alternative, a 3-week stabilization and recovery operation, would exceed the depreciated value of the rig, and the policy would not support that expenditure. Dale stood at the edge of Lander Creek on the afternoon of July 19th and looked at a machine that had been in his care for 4 years and felt the specific helplessness of a man who has run every option and found them all closed. The rig had been in the creek for 48 hours. Every hour it sat, the clay worked deeper around the frame. Every hour it sat, recovery became marginally more difficult, and the insurance math became marginally more favorable to the write-off. It was Marin Calloway who changed the direction of things. Marin farmed the quarter section on the east side of Lander Creek. Her family had been farming that ground since 1914, and she had been watching that creek, its moods and its seasons, and its particular qualities in summer for 60 years. She was standing at the fence line on the evening of July 19th when Dale came down the access road for what had become his habitual evening vigil, the way a man returns to a wound he cannot treat compulsively and without purpose. Marin said, "Do you know Harlan Dern?" Dale said he knew the name. Old farmer, north end of the county. Marin said he has a steam engine. Dale said he was sure that was very interesting. Marin said not a showpiece. A working 1921 case coal-fired, and he runs it. Has been running it since before you were born. Dale looked at her. He said he had 55 tons of rig in a creek bed. Marin said you have engineers who told you nothing would help you. You might consider a second opinion from someone who has been pulling things out of this creek for 60 years. She said it without emphasis, the way a woman states a fact she has known longer than the problem has existed. Dale said he appreciated the suggestion. Marin told him the county phone book had Harlan's number, that he answered on the second ring because he was always in the shop. Then she went back to her farm without waiting for his response. Dale sat in his truck for a while. He had a written report from a licensed geotechnical engineer telling him recovery was not feasible within the insurance window. He had an adjuster ready to process a total loss claim. He had a rig sinking incrementally deeper with every passing hour, and a professional reputation that was quietly absorbing damage every day the rig stayed in that creek. And he had a 70-year-old woman who had just told him, without argument or persuasion, that there was one more option he had not tried. He found the county phone book in his glove compartment. He found Dern H. He dialed. Harlan answered on the second ring. What followed was the kind of conversation that only happens between a man who is out of options and a man who has never needed many. Dale introduced himself and explained the situation with the thoroughness of a a man who has nothing to lose by being complete. He gave Harlan the rig's position, the angle of the chassis, the soil conditions, the crane company's assessments, the engineer's report, the insurance situation. He spoke for several minutes without interruption, laying out the problem, the way a man lays out a problem when he has analyzed it from every direction and arrived at a dead end each time. Harlan listened without speaking. When Dale was done, there was a pause, not a hesitation, the kind of pause that happens when a man is not deciding what to say, but deciding which of several things to say first. Harlan said, "How deep is the rig sitting?" Dale said the frame was on the creek bed wheels buried to the hubs, approximately 18 inches of submersion on the downstream side. Harlan said, "Which direction is it sitting? Square to the current or angled?" Dale said it was angled about 15 degrees nose slightly downstream. Harlan said, "What is the south bank like?" Dale said it was blue clay the same as the north side, but the slope was shallower and there was a gravel bar extending about 30 feet into the creek from that bank. Harlan said, "The gravel bar will carry my machine. She puts about 450 pounds per square foot on the ground, less than half what a crane outrigger puts down. If the gravel is natural, it will hold." Dale said, "What kind of machine are we talking about?" Harlan said, "Steel tracked, 12 feet on the ground, 20 inches wide per track. If the gravel bar holds, I can set up on the south side and rig across." Dale said, "You are talking about pulling a 55-ton rig." Harlan said he knew what the rig weighed. He was not trying to lift it. He was trying to slide it. There was a pause on Dale's end, a longer one this time. Harlan said, "A rig sitting in soft clay on a creek bottom does not need to be lifted. It needs to be moved laterally until it finds solid footing and can drive out under its own power. If the drivetrain is intact once the wheels find gravel, the rig can power itself the last 20 or 30 feet." Dale said the drivetrain was intact. The rig was mechanically operable. It was simply sitting in material that would not support the tires. Harlan said, "Then we are not talking about a full recovery. We are talking about getting it unstuck. Those are different problems and they require different thinking." Dale said, "What is your drawbar pull?" Harlan said, "On solid footing in first gear, around 18,000 pounds. With a 2-block rigging setup he had used before, effective pull at the load would be closer to 36,000. Given that the rig had been sitting in soft clay for 48 hours, there would be suction holding it in addition to the weight itself. He would want the 2-block arrangement." Dale said 36,000 pounds against 110,000 pounds. Harlan said, "I am not trying to lift 110,000 pounds. I am trying to start it moving through saturated clay." Those are different numbers. The clay suction on a buried frame that size at that depth is real, but it is not permanent. It releases if you give it sustained pressure over enough time. The question is not how much force. The question is how long you are willing to hold the force before the clay gives. The line was quiet for a moment. Dale said, "Can you do it?" Harlan said he would come look at it in the morning and tell Dale then. He arrived at 6:45. The morning was already warm when Harlan turned his farm truck onto the access road and parked at the south edge of the gravel bar. He climbed out and stood for a moment looking at the rig in the creek, taking in the angle and the depth and the way the current moved around the buried chassis. Then he began to walk. He walked the south bank for 45 minutes, not with instruments, not with a clipboard or a testing kit or any of the apparatus that Gus Elmhurst had brought 2 days earlier. He walked with his feet and his hands, and the 63 years of reading Kimball County ground that had accumulated in his body, the way knowledge accumulates when it is tested against real conditions over a long enough span of time. He pressed his heel into the bank at intervals and watched how the ground responded to his weight. He found the gravel bar and walked its full length, testing its edges, locating the point where the gravel composition changed and the clay began to assert itself beneath the surface. He crouched twice and pressed his palm flat against the gravel and held it there, feeling the temperature and the firmness and the particular quality of ground that tells a man whether it will hold or give when the load arrives. He was not performing these actions for the benefit of the people watching. He was reading, the way a man reads a language he learned before he learned that other languages existed. Then he walked into the creek. The water was cold even in July. It came to his knees and then his thighs as he waded out toward the buried rig, moving without hurrying, feeling the creek bottom under his boots. He reached the rig and put his hands on the frame and pushed in 4 directions. Not to move it, but to feel the quality of its resistance, the specific character of the clay's hold on the steel. He pressed his boot against the buried wheel and noted how the surrounding clay shifted under the pressure and then recovered. He looked at the angle of the chassis from 3 positions and then looked at the creek bottom between the rig's resting position and the south bank, pushing the toe of his boot down through the gravel layer to feel what lay beneath it and how deep. He spent 30 minutes in the water. Dale Pruitt watched from the bank without speaking. Gus Elmhurst watched with his notebook open. The insurance adjuster watched from a distance. Maren Calloway had come over from her farm because she had been watching that creek for 60 years herself, and she wanted to know what Harlan thought. And because she had seen Harold Dern do the same thing in the same creek in 1951, reading the bottom with his feet. And the sight of his son doing it in the same unhurried way made her feel something she could not have named precisely. When Harlan came out of the creek, he stood at the edge of the gravel bar and looked at the rig for a long, quiet moment. Then he said, "The gravel bar will hold my machine. Ground pressure is inside tolerance." Dale said, "You are certain?" Harlan said he had put her on worse. He said it without boasting the way a man states a measurement he has taken enough times to trust. Dale said, "What about the lateral path across the creek bottom, between the rig and the bank?" Harlan said there was natural gravel running 8 to 10 inches deep across most of it. The clay was below that layer. The key was getting the rig started. Clay suction on a buried vehicle frame was a real load, but once it broke free, that suction dropped fast. The first movement was the hardest. After that, the physics changed in their favor. The insurance adjuster said, "How long will it take to break the suction?" Harlan looked at him for the first time since arriving at the site. He said, "As long as it takes." He said it the way a man says something that is so obvious he is mildly surprised to be asked to say it out loud. He looked back at the rig. He said he could have the case there by that afternoon, that he would rig through the evening and overnight, and they would start pulling the following morning when the boiler was at working pressure. Dale said, "What do you need from us?" Harlan said 2 things. Keep his crew off the rigging once he had said it, because rigging that has been handled by multiple people develops uncertainties that a man needs to know about before he stresses it to its limits. And keep everyone clear of the creek during the pull. Steel cable under sustained high tension could do serious damage if something let go, and he did not want anyone near the failure radius. Dale said, "What happens if it does not work?" Harlan looked at him steadily. He said, "Then you are no worse off than you are now, and it cost you an afternoon." He drove back to his farm to get the case. He fired the boiler at 1 in the afternoon on July 20th. The process of firing a cold steam boiler is not a simple thing, and it is not a fast thing, and it cannot be made into either by impatience or urgency, no matter how urgent the reason for firing it. Harlan had learned this at 11 years old, and the lesson had never required repeating. You built the fire slowly with kindling first, and then progressively larger coal, letting the firebox temperature rise gradually, so that the metal of the boiler expanded evenly and the flues seated properly, and the crown sheet above the firebox heated at a rate that the steel could accommodate without developing the microscopic stresses that accumulated over time into the kind of failures that ended careers and occasionally ended lives. You watched the water glass and kept the water level correct, and you did not rush the pressure, because rushed pressure in a cold boiler was how men got hurt and machines got destroyed. And Harlan Dern had never hurt himself on that machine and had never destroyed any part of it. And he was not going to begin on the afternoon of July 20th, 1996, regardless of what was waiting for him at Lander Creek. By 3 in the afternoon, he had pressure. Not full working pressure, but enough to know the boiler was sound and the firing had gone correctly. He made his checks methodically. the flues from the smoke box and running the flashlight beam down each tube and looking for scale or deterioration, the safety valve lifted and seated, the water injector and the feed water pump. He walked around the machine once with his palm against the boiler casing, feeling for any temperature variation that should not be there. Everything was sound. Everything was as it had been for 63 summers. By 4 in the afternoon, he had the case on the county road heading south toward Lander Creek, the exhaust marking each stroke of the pistons, with a steady rhythm in the still July heat, the smoke rising straight up into a pale sky that held no weather and no wind. The steel wheels rang on the county gravel with a sound that carried across flat country for distances that surprised people who had not heard it before arriving before the machine itself came into view around a road bend. 3 cars encountered the case on the southbound road and fell in behind it at a distance that was respectful and also unavoidable because there was no shoulder wide enough to pass and no urgency that justified crossing the center line. A man cutting alfalfa on the east side of the road shut down his swather and stood on the platform watching until the case was out of sight behind the next section line. A boy of perhaps 12 appeared from a farm lane on a bicycle and rode alongside for a quarter mile, studying the machine with the focused attention of someone who has encountered something his experience has not prepared him for before the road turned and he fell behind. Harlan did not notice them. He was listening to the boiler the way he had listened to it for 63 years, reading the sounds the way a man reads in a language he has spoken so long. It no longer requires translation. The exhaust note told him about pressure and load. The hiss at the steam chest told him about valve condition. The behavior of the flywheel told him about the cylinders. He was not consciously analyzing any of this. He was simply present to it the way a man is present to the sounds of his own farm after decades of mornings aware without attending knowing, without deciding to know. He arrived at the Lander Creek site at 5:30 in the afternoon. Dale Pruitt was waiting at the south end of the access road. Behind him stood the 2 Crane Company representatives who had assessed the site earlier in the week and driven back out when word reached them that someone was attempting a steam-powered recovery. Gus Elmhurst was there with his notebook under his arm. Maren Calloway stood at the fence line between her property and the creek access where she had stood 2 evenings ago when she redirected Dale Pruitt's search. The Crane Company representatives watched the case come down the access road with expressions that were not contemptuous. They were uncertain, which is a more honest response and in some ways more revealing. They had assessed the site with the full apparatus of modern crane engineering and concluded recovery was not possible. The machine coming toward them was 75 years old and ran on coal. Their uncertainty was the uncertainty of men who could not immediately place what they were seeing within the framework of what they knew. Harlan positioned the case on the gravel bar 90 feet back from the water's edge and shut down the throttle. The exhaust rhythm slowed and stopped. The flywheel completed its final revolutions and was still. He climbed off the platform, stood on the gravel, and pressed his heel down once to confirm what he had already determined that morning. The bar was holding. It would hold the machine and everything the machine was about to do. He unloaded the rigging from the supply sled he had towed behind the case. 2 snatch blocks each rated at 40 tons, forged steel, marked with the foundry stamp of a manufacturer that had been out of business for 30 years, but whose work remained sound in every link and sheave. 160 feet of 3/4-inch steel cable coiled without kinks, which was the only acceptable way to store cable you intended to trust with your life and someone else's equipment. A logging chain of forged steel links, as thick as a grown man's thumb, 60 years old. Sound as the day it was made, because properly maintained, steel does not age the way people expect it to. 4 anchor stakes cut from railroad rail, which Harlan had been carrying on that sled for 2 decades against the day a job required them. Then he went back into the creek. This time he carried a 4-foot length of rebar. He moved from the south bank toward the buried rig, pressing the rebar into the creek bottom at every third step, feeling through the steel rod, the depth of the gravel layer, and the character of the clay beneath it, mapping the path the rig would need to travel as it moved from its current position to solid footing. The gravel was consistent across most of the distance, 8 to 10 inches deep, with the clay below it, behaving as clay behaves when it is wet and compressed, not loose, not flowing, but not immovable either. Movable with the right force, applied the right way for the right amount of time. He spent 25 minutes in the water this time. When he came out, he did not speak immediately. He stood at the bar's edge and considered what he had found, not with doubt, but with the specific attention of a man completing a calculation he began before he stepped into the water. Then he began to rig. The first snatch block went against the anchor stakes on the south bank. He drove the railroad rail stakes with the case's steam-powered hammer, 2 on each side of the intended cable run, and chained the first block around the paired stakes with a chain wrapped and pinned, so that the load would transfer to the stakes and through them to the bank rather than to the chain itself. The cable ran from the drum on the case through the first block's sheave and across the creek bottom toward the buried rig. He waded out again to attach the second block directly to the drilling rig's front frame. This required judgment about where to attach. He did not chain to the first structural member he could reach. He worked his way along the front of the buried chassis until he found the heaviest longitudinal frame rail accessible, wrapped the chain around it, and secured it with 2 choker chains, run at different angles so that the pull would be distributed across the frame structure rather than concentrated at a single weld or connection. The cable then returned from the second block back across the creek to a dead man anchor, a buried timber backed by 2 additional railroad rail stakes, set in the bank behind and offset to the side of the case. 2 blocks. A 2-to-1 mechanical advantage that the block and tackle arrangement created without any moving parts more complex than a sheave and a frame. The case's 18,000 pounds of drawbar pull multiplied through that arrangement delivered 36,000 pounds of sustained force to the drilling rig's frame. 36,000 pounds was not enough to lift 55 tons. It was not intended to be. 36,000 pounds sustained against clay suction, estimated at somewhere between 20 and 30,000 pounds, was enough to start the load moving. Once the suction broke and once the load was moving, the physics of the problem changed entirely. Dale Pruitt stayed through the evening and into the night. He had sent his crew back to the motel in Kimball at 10 o'clock, but he stayed himself, sitting on the tailgate of his truck with a thermos of coffee and the particular alertness of a man watching work he cannot help with but cannot stop watching. Occasionally Harlan needed a second pair of hands to hold a block steady while a chain was pinned, or to keep tension on a cable while he moved to the next connection point, and Dale held what needed holding when Harlan indicated it with a look or a gesture without speaking unnecessarily and without needing to be shown the same thing twice. He was learning something during those hours, though he could not yet have named precisely what it was. He was watching a man work with a quality of attention that did not vary between the technically difficult steps and the routine ones, because for Harlan Dern, there were no routine steps. Every connection mattered at the same level as every other connection, because every connection would be loaded to the limits of its rating in the morning, and a system stressed to its limits has no tolerance for the casual. The distinction between careful and careless did not exist in Harlan's approach to rigging. There was only one category, which was correct. At 2 in the morning, Harlan stopped, not because the rigging was finished, it was not quite finished, but the remaining work required good light and fresh eyes, and the rigging that was already set needed to be checked in daylight before any load was applied. He had always believed this. A man who rigs in darkness and trusts that darkness without checking it in light is a man who discovers his errors at the worst possible moment, which is always the moment of maximum load. He sat on the platform of the case and drank from the thermos he had brought from home. The creek moved below him in the July darkness. The rig sat in the water at its fixed angle, unchanged. Since the morning of July 17th, the chassis submerged to the same depth, the downstream tilt, the same 15 degrees it had been when the blue clay first accepted the weight of 55 tons and decided it would not give them back. Harlan sat on the platform and looked at the rig and let himself ask the question he had been keeping at the edge of his thinking since he had waded into the creek that morning and felt the character of the clay. The question was whether he was certain. He had been reading ground in Kimball County for 63 years. He had pulled stumps from soil this wet in the 1950s and moved machinery across creek bottoms, not unlike this one in the 1960s, and recovered equipment from saturated ground in 1974 and again in 1987. He had read the bottom of Lander Creek with his feet and his hands and the accumulated understanding of all those years, and he had told Dale Pruitt that the rigging would work and the clay would release and the rig would move. He thought it would work, but sitting on the platform of the case at 2 a.m. with the creek moving below him, and 70 people planning to stand on that bank in 5 hours. He allowed himself to acknowledge that thinking something would work and knowing it would work were not the same condition. He had spoken to Dale Pruitt and to Gus Elmhurst and to the insurance adjuster with the clarity of a man who had tested these principles enough times to trust them. He trusted them, but trust was not certainty, and certainty was not available to him at 2 a.m. beside a Nebraska creek in July. He thought it was important to be honest with himself about that, while he still had the darkness to be honest and before the light came and the throttle had to be opened and the outcome accepted, whatever it was. He sat for 10 minutes without doing anything. The creek moved. The rig held its angle. The case sat on the gravel bar behind him, the boiler cold, the pressure bled off for the night. Then he got up and went back to the rigging. He went back because the rigging was not finished, and leaving rigging half done in the dark was worse than leaving it not started. He went back because sitting with the question of whether he was certain was not a process that ended in certainty. Certainty, if it came through the work and out the other side of it, not before. The answer would come when the throttle was opened and the cable came tight and the clay was asked to release. He finished the remaining connections and climbed off the platform and drove the 2 miles to where he had arranged to sleep a few hours in his truck cab before the morning. Dale had been sitting on the running board of his own truck watching. He had seen Harlan stop and sit on the platform. He had seen the quality of that stillness, which was not rest, but thinking, the kind of thinking that required a man to be still. He had not spoken during it. When Harlan went back to the rigging, Dale got up and held his flashlight on the connections being made, because that was what was useful. After a while, as Harlan was finishing the last connection, Dale said quietly, "How many times have you done something on this scale?" Harlan thought about it honestly before answering. He said nothing with these exact dimensions. Different problems, same machine, same approach. Dale said, "What is the hardest pull you ever made with her?" Harlan was quiet a moment. He said there was a concrete grain bin foundation in 1974 poured in 1934, 40 years in the ground, and frost heaved to one side over 2 decades until the bin it supported was tilted past usable. A contractor had assessed it and told the owner the foundation was immovable without a crane, and that breaking it up and pouring new was the only practical option. The quote for that work was more than the bin was worth, so the owner called Harlan because he had heard about the machine from a neighbor. Harlan said he rigged the case to that foundation with a single block and a logging chain and pulled for 40 minutes before it moved. When it moved 6 inches and stopped, and he pulled another 20 minutes before it came free all at once and slid 12 feet across the frozen yard before he could close the throttle. The owner had been standing to the side watching, and when the foundation moved, he said out loud to no one in particular that he had not actually expected it to work. He said it the way a man says something that surprises him into honesty. Dale said, "Did you expect it to work?" Harlan said he had thought it would. He said there was a difference between thinking a thing will work and knowing it will work, and that most of the serious work he had done in his life had been done in the space between those two positions, holding both possibilities at once and letting the work move him from one toward the other. He said certainty was a condition you arrived at through the work, not a condition you brought to it. Dale was quiet after that for a long time. At 5 in the morning, Harlan fired the boiler. The eastern sky was moving from black to gray when the first coal caught and the firebox began the slow climb toward working temperature. The creek was low and silver in the early light, and the rig sat in it exactly as it had sat the previous morning, and the morning before, that the 15-degree angle unchanged, the chassis half submerged, looking no more recoverable in the early light than it had looked to the insurance adjuster 5 days ago. Harlan walked the complete rigging in the growing light before the pressure reached working level. He walked each cable run from the drum through the first block to the creek crossing to the second block on the rig's frame and back to the dead man anchor. He checked every chain connection, every pin, every shackle. He pressed on each anchor stake with his full body weight and held the pressure testing whether the overnight ground moisture had changed their resistance. He looked at each snatch block and ran his thumb across the sheaves and checked the pins by feel and by eye. Everything was set correctly. Everything was sound. By 6:30, he had walked the rigging a second time, not because he doubted the first check, but because rigging that will carry 36,000 pounds deserves 2 checks, and the second check is different from the first because you are looking for different things, the things that the first check missed because you were looking for other things. By 7 o'clock, the steam gauge read 138 pounds per square inch. He wanted 140. He added coal to the firebox and waited. The needle climbed with the patience of a needle that has been making this journey for 75 years and has no interest in hurrying. The crowd had gathered on the south bank while Harlan was making his checks. It had begun with Marin Calloway arriving before first light in her farm truck. Then Dale's crew came back from the Kimball Motel, 4 men who stood together at the north bank and watched without speaking the way men who work with heavy equipment watch a heavy equipment problem. Gus Elmhurst arrived at 6:45 with his notebook open and a pencil in his hand, which was the stance of a man who had already decided this morning was worth documenting. The insurance adjuster arrived at 7 and stayed near his car, which was also a kind of decision. The 2 crane company representatives returned for the second morning in a row, which said something about what they expected to see. Word had moved through Kimball County the night before the way word moves through farming communities without any central organizing mechanism through the early morning phone calls that neighbors make when something worth knowing has occurred. And by 7:30, there were perhaps 70 people on the south bank and along the elevated edges of the access road. Farm families who had come because they had heard that Harlan Dern was going to pull a 55-ton drilling rig out of Lander Creek with the old case, and because this was something you did not hear about and decide to stay home for. A photographer from the Kimball Weekly paper had driven out before sunrise and set up at the best angle she could find. Harlan looked at the steam gauge, 140 pounds per square inch. He looked at the rigging from the platform of the case, following each element from the drum through the arrangement of blocks and cable to the buried rig and back to the dead man anchor. He looked at the gravel bar and the anchor stakes and the creek bottom between the machine and the load. He opened the throttle, not quickly. The throttle on the case was a lever that moved through a quadrant, and Harlan moved it the way he had moved it for 63 years, with the specific deliberateness of a man who understands that the first seconds of a loaded pull establish the conditions for everything that follows. Too fast, and you snap something. Too slow, and the load never comes fully on. There was a right speed for opening a throttle into a loaded pull, and Harlan knew it in his hands and in his shoulders and in the part of his body that had been listening to this machine for 6 decades. The steam entered the cylinders, the pistons began their stroke, the crankshaft turned, the flywheel 4 feet in diameter and weighing 1,600 pounds began its rotation with the slow authoritative momentum of something that once moving does not easily stop. The cable began to take up its slack, not with a snap or a jerk, with a building of tension that moved through the system, element by element, the sag coming out of the cable as the load came on the first snatch block, groaning as the force transferred through its sheave, the anchor stakes shuddering once in the bank soil, and then holding the dead man anchor, settling a fraction of an inch and then firm against the earth behind it. The case itself shifted slightly on its tracks as the drawbar load transferred weight toward the rear of the machine the way a man's back shifts when he lifts. For 2 full minutes, the drilling rig did not visibly move. This was the moment Harlan had described to Dale, the suction. The blue clay of the Lander Creek bottom had 4 days to work itself into every available space around the buried frame. It had filled the gap between the axle housings and the creek bed. It had conformed to the differential housings and the frame rails and the underside of the chassis and every flat surface that presented itself to the surrounding material. Clay does not grip in the way a hand grips. It grips in the way water grips, through intimate contact distributed across every available surface, the cumulative pressure of a material that has had time to settle completely against the thing it surrounds. To release that grip required not a single peak of force, but a sustained, unrelenting presence of force that gave the clay no moment of relief and no opportunity to find a new equilibrium. The case delivered it. The exhaust chuffed once per stroke. The flywheel turned. The steam pushed against the pistons at 140 pounds per square inch, and at the slow crawl of the loaded pull, the steam had time that faster engines never give their steam. Time to push completely. Time to work. The cable hummed at a frequency that was felt in the sternum before it was heard by the ear. The snatch blocks groaned with a sound that was serious, but not alarming, the sound of engineered metal working at the upper end of its rated load. The anchor stakes in the bank held without further movement. In the creek bed, invisible to everyone watching from the bank, something was beginning to happen. The clay was not yet releasing. It was being asked to release steadily and without pause by 36,000 pounds of sustained force applied through a 2-block rigging arrangement to the heaviest structural member of a buried machine. The clay was resisting with the full weight of its grip, the grip of days and depth and intimate contact, and the cable was holding its load, and the case was holding its throttle, and neither of them was going to stop. Harlan sat on the platform and felt the load through the seat and through the throttle lever and through the sound the machine made under that load. The exhaust note had changed from the free exhaust of an unloaded engine to the labored deep note of an engine fully engaged, the sound of steam working against maximum resistance. He did not change the throttle. He did not increase it or decrease it. He held it exactly where it was, steady, patient, constant. At 2 minutes and 40 seconds, a sound came from the creek bed. It was not a dramatic sound, not the crack of something breaking or the bang of something suddenly giving way. It was a low, liquid, organic sound somewhere between a deep groan and a slow exhalation, the sound of a saturated material releasing its hold on a surface it had been gripping for 4 days. The sound of clay doing what clay eventually does when the force asking it to release is patient enough and sustained enough and absolutely refuses to be anything other than present. Every one of the 70 people on the South Bank heard it and understood it instantly, the way people understand sounds that they have been unconsciously waiting for. The recognition was not intellectual, it was physical. People held their breath without deciding to. The rig moved, 6 inches of lateral displacement, the nose shifting toward the South Bank, the chassis rotating slightly as the geometry of the pull translated into movement. 6 inches was not a dramatic distance. In any other context, 6 inches was nothing. But in this context, 6 inches was everything, because 6 inches meant the suction had broken, and a suction that had broken would not reestablish itself at the same strength. And a load that had moved once would move again because the conditions that had prevented the first movement no longer fully existed. Harlan felt it through the seat. The specific quality of the resistance changed. The deadweight feeling of a load held by suction gave way to the different lesser resistance of mass in motion through saturated clay. He did not change the throttle. He did not celebrate. He kept the pull exactly where it was steady and unvarying, because a load that has just started moving is a load that can stop again if you give it any reason to. The rig moved again, a foot, then 2 feet. The front tires, buried to their hubs in clay, began to encounter the gravel layer beneath the creek bottom. The frame lifted a fraction. As the tires found solid resistance below them, the chassis geometry changing in small ways as the weight distribution shifted. Dale Pruitt was standing at the water's edge. He said one word. The man standing next to him later said it was spoken very quietly, the way a man says something to himself when something he has stopped believing in begins to come true. It was not a word meant for anyone else, and no one pretended to have heard it. At 5 minutes, the rig had moved 8 feet. The nose was in shallower water. The front tires were on gravel. At 9 minutes, Dale climbed down the bank and waded into the creek. He reached the rig's cab door and signaled his operator, who had been standing on the far bank for 2 hours, waiting for exactly this signal. The operator climbed up to the cab. The diesel engine turned over and caught on the second attempt. It had been submerged for 5 days, and it started on the second attempt because Dale Pruitt maintained his equipment the way Harlan Dern maintained his, which was the maintenance of a man who understands that a machine properly cared for will answer when you need it to answer. The rig's rear drive wheels bit into the gravel creek bottom as the case continued its steady pull. The combination of the steam engine's sustained drawbar force and the rig's own drivetrain working in the same direction brought the machine through the remaining distance in 11 minutes. Moving steadily, wheels, turning frame, rising as the water depth decreased, and the footing improved each foot of progress, making the next foot easier. At 27 minutes from the first movement, the drilling rig drove up the south bank under its own power and stopped on dry gravel with all its wheels on solid ground and the creek behind it. The crowd on the bank made a sound that was not organized and not polite and not anything that any of those 70 people had planned to make. It was the sound that comes out of people when they have been holding something for a long time, and the thing they have been holding suddenly releases a collective exhaling of tension that expressed itself as cheering and clapping and one long sustained blast from a truck horn that Dale's crew had been holding in reserve for exactly this moment. Harlan closed the throttle. The exhaust slowed. The flywheel coasted through its final revolutions and was still. He sat on the platform for a moment, looking at the creek, at the cable going slack in the water, at the rig sitting on solid ground on the south bank, at the 2 snatch blocks hanging from their anchors, intact sound ready for the next 40 pulls if called upon. Then he climbed down and began to unrig. He did not raise his hand to the crowd. He did not turn toward the sound behind him. He moved to the nearest anchor stake and began the work of bringing the rigging down in the correct sequence, because rigging taken down in the wrong sequence can load components that are not designed to take that load. And because the blocks needed to be inspected before they were stored, and because the cable needed to be coiled without kinks from one end to the other. Kinks were where cable failed. A failed cable was a danger and an expense, and neither was acceptable. He was working on the second anchor chain when Dale Pruitt walked over and stopped at the edge of the rigging area. He waited until Harlan reached a natural stopping point. Then he said, "Mr. Dern." Harlan looked at him. Dale said, "I had 2 engineering assessments and an insurance adjuster telling me that rig was a total loss." Harlan said he knew. Dale said, "How did you know they were wrong?" Harlan coiled another section of cable before answering. He said they were not wrong about what they calculated. They calculated correctly. What they were wrong about was the question they were answering. Dale said, explain that. Harlan set down the coiled section. He said they were thinking about cranes. Crane recovery means lifting, and lifting means you need crane capacity equal to the load plus the ground pressure to support the crane, and the ground would not support a crane large enough to lift that rig. So they concluded recovery was not feasible. That conclusion was correct given the question they were answering. He looked at Dale directly. He said, but the question was wrong. The rig did not need to be lifted. It needed to be moved. Lifting and moving are different problems. They require different calculations, different equipment, different thinking. Your engineers never asked whether the rig could be moved because their training gave them a framework where recovery meant lifting. Outside that framework, their calculation had nothing to work with. Gus Elmhurst had been standing within earshot. He was the kind of engineer who, when he found that his assessment had been incomplete, wanted to understand the incompleteness completely, not for professional self-protection, but because incomplete assessments were professional failures that needed to be fully understood in order not to be repeated. He said the effective pull through the two-block arrangement, 36,000 pounds sustained. Harlan said give or take. Gus said the clay suction on a frame that size at that depth of submersion, I would estimate 20 to 30,000 pounds to initiate movement. Harlan said that sounded about right. Gus said we were calculating lift capacity for a 200-ton crane. We were looking at numbers that had nothing to do with what the problem actually required. Harlan said you usually are when you are thinking lift instead of slide. He said it without condescension as a simple statement of how frameworks operate. Then he went back to the rigging. The work of unrigging took another hour, the blocks inspected and packed, the cable coiled and secured, the anchor stakes pulled and loaded, the logging chain cleaned of creek mud, inspected link by link, and stowed. Harlan did all of it with the same attention he had given the rigging the night before because equipment packed correctly was equipment ready for the next job, and equipment packed carelessly would fail at the moment of greatest need, which was always the worst possible moment. By the time he was done, the crowd had dispersed. Dale and his crew were running a full mechanical inspection of the rig on the south bank. Gus Elmhurst was in his vehicle with his notebook. Maren Calloway had gone back to her farm. The creek ran at its summer level, low and clear, already filling the depression the rig had left in its bed. Dale came back one more time before Harlan left. He held out an envelope. He said 250 was what you asked. 300 is what I owe you. I hope the difference says something that I cannot quite say in words. Harlan took the envelope and put it in his shirt pocket without opening it. He said, keep your drivetrain clean. Creek water works into places you would not expect. Dale said he would. Harlan climbed onto the platform of the case and opened the throttle. The exhaust began its rhythm. The flywheel turned. He turned to the machine on the gravel bar and pointed it back toward the county road, and the afternoon swallowed the sound of the exhaust and the ring of the steel wheels on gravel as he moved north through the summer heat toward home. He stopped at Maren Calloway's lane on the way north. She came out to the fence when she heard the machine coming. She said, I heard it worked. He said it worked. She said, I knew it would. He looked at her. He said, you thought it would. There is a difference. She laughed. He drove on. The afternoon light was long and pale over the Nebraska fields, the corn standing in the heat. Heavy way. It stands in mid-July, the wheat on the cut sections already stubble. Harlan drove through the county he had farmed for 53 years and let the machine carry him home at its own speed, which was the only speed it had and the only speed he needed. He brought the case home and began the shutdown sequence immediately because the shutdown sequence was as important as the startup sequence, and neither could be abbreviated without cost. He bled the pressure off through the safety valve, slowly letting the temperature drop at the rate the boiler preferred. He did not hurry it. The boiler had waited 4 years for someone to ask it to do what it had done today. It could take the time it needed to come down correctly. He checked the flues by flashlight in the evening light. He greased the track guides. He checked the valve timing on both sides by feel, working each admission valve slowly through its range and feeling for the specific quality of resistance that told him the setting was correct. On the left side, he found a small advancement from the correct position, the vibration of the loaded pull, having moved the valve a fraction from its setting over 27 minutes of maximum load. He made the adjustment. It took 4 minutes and required a specific touch that he had developed over decades of making the same adjustment. When it was correct, he could feel that it was correct. That feeling was not something he could have described to someone who did not already have it. He went inside and took the maintenance notebook from the shelf above the workbench. He sat at the workbench and wrote the entry for July 21st, 1996. Lander Creek, drilling rig, recovery, 2-block rig, 27 minutes from movement to bank, boiler pressure held 138 to 142 throughout. Left valve timing, small adjustment after. Machine ran well. He closed the notebook and put it back on the shelf. He went inside and made his supper. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet after a day of significant work. A different quality of quiet from ordinary evenings, fuller and more settled, as if the day had put something down that needed putting down. What Harlan did not know and could not have known as he went about his evening was that the morning of July 21st had not ended when he drove the case back down the county road. It had continued in the way that certain mornings continue through the people who had witnessed it, and carried something away that they had not expected to carry, something that would change the way they worked and taught and assessed problems for the rest of their professional lives. He did not know this. He ate his supper. He went to bed. Outside, the Nebraska night settled over the county, and the creek ran at its summer level, and the gravel bar sat empty where the case had stood, and the marks the steel wheels had pressed into the gravel were already beginning to fill. The summer of 1996 ended the way Nebraska summers end, not with a single day that announces autumn, but with a slow withdrawal of heat over several weeks, the mornings arriving cooler by degrees, the light changing its angle, the fields moving through their harvest colors toward the pale quiet of October. Harlan Dern cut his wheat, put up his equipment for the season, and prepared the case for winter the way he had prepared it every year since Curtis first showed him the shutdown procedure in 1934. He drained the water from the boiler according to the sequence Curtis had established, because a boiler properly winterized would fire correctly in spring, and a boiler winterized carelessly would teach you the cost of that carelessness at the worst possible moment, which was always the moment you needed it most. He did not spend much time thinking about Lander Creek in the weeks that followed. The job was done. The rig was out. The rigging was inspected and stowed. The notebook had its entry. There was wheat to cut and equipment to service, and the 100 seasonal tasks that do not wait for a man to finish reflecting before they require his attention. What Harlan did not know, sitting at his workbench in October with winter coming across the plains, was that the morning of July 21st had not ended when he turned the case north on the county road. It had continued the way certain mornings continue through the people who had been there and carried something away with them that changed the way they understood problems, and through those people into the institutions they worked within, and through those institutions into practices that would outlast all of them. Dale Pruitt drove the drilling rig to Lexington for inspection over the 3 days following the recovery. The frame was undamaged, the drivetrain was sound, the drilling components had survived immersion better than anyone had predicted, which Dale attributed to the quality of the seals on the 1991 National, and to the fact that the rig had been recovered in less than 5 days. Within 2 weeks, the rig was back in Kimball County, and the test well program continued. The summer's work concluded without further incident. Dale drove back to Cheyenne. He filed his incident report with the drilling company thorough and accurate, naming Harlan Dern and the steam traction engine and the 2-block rigging arrangement and the 27 minutes from first movement to recovery. He included Harlan's explanation of sustained lateral force and clay suction release. He included Gus Elmhurst's comment about the differential between the lift capacity required by conventional recovery and the slide force required by the method that had worked. He wrote it the way a man writes something he intends to be useful to other people who will encounter similar situations. The drilling company's operations manager read the report and called Dale with 3 specific questions. He then called the company's training coordinator and asked her to read the report and consider its implications for the creek crossing assessment protocol currently in use across all operations. The training coordinator's name was Patricia Hendricks. She had spent 12 years in field operations before moving to training, which meant she read the report not as a training problem but as a field problem, understanding from the inside what the situation at Lander Creek had required and why the existing framework had not provided it. The existing protocol asked whether the ground could support the equipment being moved. It did not ask what recovery options existed if the ground failed. It did not ask whether lateral recovery was possible. It did not ask whether the equipment's own drivetrain was intact and could contribute to its own recovery under assisted pull conditions. These were different questions. They were questions the existing protocol had never needed to ask because the existing protocol had been written within a recovery framework built entirely around crane extraction, and crane extraction required lift capacity. And if the ground could not support the crane, then recovery was not feasible and the loss was declared total. The existing protocol had never seriously considered whether there was a category of recovery that did not require lifting at all. Patricia Hendricks spent 6 weeks developing an addendum she called lateral recovery assessment. It asked field supervisors at every creek and river crossing site to evaluate whether lateral recovery was theoretically possible in the event of a sink-in, what the recovery path would look like, what the substrate conditions along that path were, and whether equipment with low ground pressure and sustained drawbar capacity was available within a feasible distance. It asked them to record this information before committing equipment to the crossing, not after. The addendum entered the company's field operations manual in January of 1997. The notation at the bottom of the relevant section read, based on field observation, Kimball County, Nebraska, July 1996. Harlan Dern's name did not appear in the manual. The steam traction engine was not mentioned. Dale had thought carefully about whether to include Harlan's name and had decided against it not to diminish what Harlan had done. But because Harlan's name in a corporate training manual invited questions, the manual could not answer questions about how a 74-year-old farmer with a 75-year-old machine constituted a recovery resource, questions that would pull the discussion from the principle toward the particular, and the particular was not the point. The principle was the point. The principle was that lateral recovery was a category that existed and needed to be assessed. The particular instance that had demonstrated the principle had done its work by demonstrating it. The principle did not need Harlan's name to be true. The influence spread the way influence spreads when it is embedded in institutional practice rather than attributed to a person. Other drilling companies adopted versions of the addendum when they updated their protocols in the years that followed. By 2001, lateral recovery assessment was standard procedure in most major drilling operation protocols across the Central Plains. Nobody traced it back to July 21st, 1996. Nobody needed to. The principle had become so obviously correct that questioning its origin seemed beside the point. Harlan Dern never knew any of this. He ran his farm and maintained the case and answered the phone on the second ring and went to the county fair every summer and fired the boiler and ran the engine under load because the fair committee asked him every year, and the answer was yes. In the autumn of 1997, Maren Calloway mentioned to Harlan over the fence line that she had heard from a contact in Omaha, someone in engineering consulting, that someone had been discussing the Lander Creek recovery at a technical conference. Harlan said, "Which conference?" Maren said she did not know exactly something in the petroleum engineering field. Harlan said, "Is that right?" Then he asked how her winter wheat was looking, and the conversation moved where conversations between neighboring farmers in autumn tend to move toward the ground and the coming season and the practical questions that would not wait. Gus Elmhurst drove home to Kearney on the afternoon of July 21st and wrote his supplementary report that evening. He addressed in precise technical language the error of methodology that had caused his initial assessment to conclude that recovery was not feasible. He described the two-block rigging arrangement and the mechanical advantage calculation and the sustained force curve of steam power relative to internal combustion and its relevance to clay suction release. He described the distinction between vertical lift recovery and lateral slide recovery and the conditions under which each was appropriate. He was not writing this to protect himself professionally. He was writing it because an incomplete assessment was a professional failure, and a professional failure needed to be fully understood in order not to be repeated by him or by anyone he could reach. He sent copies to the crane company, to his licensing board, and to the company that had hired him for the original assessment. He kept a copy in a file he labeled Lander Creek, and that file stayed on the shelf of his home office for the next 20 years. In the spring of 1998, Gus was invited to present at a continuing education seminar for geotechnical engineers in Omaha. The organizers asked him to choose a case study that illustrated a lesson worth sharing with practitioners. He chose Lander Creek without hesitation. He stood before 63 geotechnical engineers in a conference room and described with precision and without defensiveness the way he had assessed the creek crossing site, the conclusions he had reached, and the reason those conclusions had been wrong. He described what Harlan Dern had done and how he had done it. He described the steam engine and the two-block rigging and the 27 minutes and the conversation at the bank afterward, where a 74-year-old farmer had explained to a credentialed engineer the difference between lifting and sliding, between peak force and sustained force, between the question he had been answering and the question he should have asked. He said the words he had been working toward for 2 years of thinking about that July morning. He said, "We calculated correctly. We asked the wrong question." He said, "I had the penetrometer and the Shelby tubes and the load tables and 20 years of geotechnical experience, and I looked at that problem and saw the version of it that my training had prepared me to see. I did not ask whether there was a version of the problem my training had not prepared me to see. The error was not in the calculation. The error was in the question." A man with 60 years of experience and a machine from 1921 asked a different question, and the different question had an answer that my question did not have. The room was quiet after that, for a moment longer than rooms are usually quiet after a presentation point. 2 engineers who attended that seminar changed specific elements of their assessment protocols in the following year. One of them told Gus later at a professional gathering in Lincoln that the Lander Creek case study had changed the way he framed problems at the earliest stage of assessment before any calculation began. He said it had made him suspicious of his first question in a way he had not been suspicious before. He said that was a hard thing to teach and a harder thing to learn, and that he had not learned it from anything except hearing about Lander Creek. In September of 1999, Gus drove out to the Dern farm unannounced on a Saturday morning and stood at the equipment barn door and said he wanted Harlan to know how the story had continued. Harlan listened without interrupting the way he always listened, and when Gus was done, Harlan nodded once and said, "That sounds like useful work." Gus said, "I wanted you to know what you started." Harlan said, "I pulled a rig out of a creek. What happened after that is what you started." Gus drove back to Kearney. Harlan went back to the valve he had been adjusting when the car pulled in. The years moved the way years move on a farm, by season and by task, and by the accumulated small decisions that amount to a life. In February of 2001, a combine belonging to a farmer named Eckhart went through the ice of a frozen pond on the northwest quarter of his property. The ice had looked sounder than it was during a cold snap that hardened the surface without thickening it. 2 tractors had been tried before Eckhart called Harlan, and both had pulled until their wheels spun without moving the combine, because the rear axle was held by the same clay suction and substrate load that had held the drilling rig at Lander Creek. Harlan arrived, walked the ice edge to find its solid boundary, rigged the case to the combine with a single block and a logging chain, and pulled for 31 minutes before the combine moved. 18 minutes more to get it across the solid ice and onto the bank. Eckhart offered $300. Harlan asked for $250. Eckhart paid $300 and said he was grateful in the plain way that men are grateful when a problem they had begun to consider permanent turns out not to be. In the summer of 2004, a concrete irrigation header on the Mervyn property east of Kimball settled over the previous winter into the silty soil beside the irrigation ditch it was supposed to serve. It had gone down 18 inches and now sat below the ditch grade, non-functional. A contractor quoted a price for demolition and replacement that was more than the Mervyn family wanted to spend. They called Harlan because Eckhart had told them to call Harlan when you had something that nothing else would move. Harlan rigged the case to the header with a 2-block arrangement and pulled for 43 minutes before it lifted and began to slide. He repositioned it over 2 pulls. Mervyn paid him from a coffee can he brought out from the kitchen, and they shook hands at the farm gate, the way transactions between farming neighbors have been concluded in Nebraska since before either of them was born. These were the last 2 recovery jobs Harlan did with the case. Not because the calls stopped coming and not because the machine stopped working. The machine was running in 2006, as well as it had run in 1946, which was as well as it had run in 1933, which was as well as it had run when it left the factory in Racine in 1921, because it had been maintained according to the procedures Curtis established, and that Harlan had followed and refined for 63 years without deviation. A machine maintained correctly does not deteriorate on any schedule that cannot be addressed by a man with the right knowledge. What changed in 2007 was not the machine. What changed was Harlan. He noticed it first in the winter of 2006, the way a man notices something he does not want to be noticing, in small incidents that he explains individually before the pattern makes individual explanation insufficient. He was adjusting the left admission valve, the same adjustment he had made hundreds of times, and he found that he could not reliably feel whether the valve had reached its correct setting. The valve timing on the case was set by feel, not by measurement, because the measurement that mattered was the feel of the steam delivery through the admission event, and that feel lived in the hands of the man making the adjustment in the nerve endings, and the muscle memory of 63 years of doing the same work with the same hands. In the winter of 2006, the hands were giving him something different from what they had always given him. He tested himself over the following months with the careful honesty of a man who already knows the answer and is simply confirming it through due diligence. He made adjustments and verified them by other means. Each time he asked himself whether what his hands had told him was what the machine confirmed. The correlation was less reliable than it had been. Not absent, not dramatically wrong, but less reliable in the specific way that mattered most for a man operating a live steam boiler at 140 pounds per square inch. A man who cannot feel his fittings has no business operating a steam boiler at working pressure. This was not a principle that required argument or sentiment. It was the same principle that had caused Aldous Greer to sell the case when his eyes went bad and made him unable to read the gauges. The machine required a man who could feel it correctly. If Harlan could no longer feel it correctly, the machine required a different man. And the time for finding that man was now, while Harlan still could show him everything, not later when the showing might not be possible. He did not tell anyone, not Marin Calloway at the fence line, not his neighbors, not anyone at the county fair. He ran the case through the 2007 fair season, because by then he had made his decision and wanted one more season with the machine before the decision took effect. And because at the fair the case ran under no recovery load and no crisis, and his hands were adequate for that work. He called his nephew Owen Dern on a Tuesday morning in April of 2007 and said, "Owen, I need you to come out on Saturday. I need to show you some things about the machine." Owen was 44 years old, the son of Harlan's younger brother Gerald, who had left Kimball County in 1961 for Omaha. Owen had grown up in Omaha and gone to the University of Nebraska for mechanical engineering, which was a field he had chosen in part because of the case, or more precisely because of 2 summers he had spent at Harlan's farm when he was 12 and 13, watching Harlan maintain the machine and understanding, even at that age, that what he was watching was a form of knowledge he wanted to understand better than a boy's summer visits allowed. He had graduated in 1985 and gone to work for a manufacturing equipment firm in Omaha. The work used his degree and he was good at it, and he was promoted twice and managed a group of engineers and did the work correctly and went home in the evenings with the particular hollowness that comes from work that uses your mind but not your whole self. He understood the hollowness but could not name its cause for a long time. He was doing the work he had trained to do. He was doing it well. The firm was reputable and the pay was fair and his colleagues were people he respected. Everything that was supposed to constitute a satisfying professional life was present. The satisfaction was not. In the evenings in his apartment in Omaha, he would sometimes find himself thinking about the equipment barn at Harlan's farm, not nostalgically, not with the softened memory of a man romanticizing his past. He would think about the specific smell of the shop coal dust and machine oil and the particular metallic warmth that a steam boiler holds for hours after it has been fired down. He would think about the feeling of a fitting that was right under his hands, the specific quality of resistance and give that told you the thread had seated, and the seal was complete, a feeling that his engineering work used instruments to confirm, but that he had first learned to feel without instruments sitting on an overturned crate in Harlan's equipment barn at 12 years old, watching his uncle make the same check for the 100th time and holding the flashlight steady because that was what was useful. He began to understand slowly and without drama that what he was missing was not the farm itself or the machine itself, but the quality of knowledge that the farm and the machine had first shown him existed, the knowledge that lived in the hands, the knowledge that could not be obtained through any course of study, but only through long contact with a thing you cared for, the way Harlan cared for the case, until the distinction between the man and the tool blurred at the edges, and you were no longer sure where the understanding of one ended and the understanding of the other began. In August of 1996, 3 weeks after Lander Creek, Owen visited the farm for a week. He saw the case in the equipment yard and heard Harlan describe the recovery in the understated way Harlan described everything, and something settled into place for Owen that had been unsettled for 11 years. He could not have named it precisely. He knew it had to do with the difference between work that uses your knowledge and work that uses your whole self, with the knowledge that lives in the hands and cannot be obtained any other way. He knew it had to do with the machine and the man who ran it, and with the fact that the man who ran it had solved a problem that credentialed engineers had declared unsolvable, not by having more knowledge in the formal sense, but by having a different kind of knowledge that formal training did not provide. He left Omaha in the spring of 1997 and returned to Kimball County. He bought the old Hendrickson place, a quarter section with a house and a shop and an equipment barn, and established a machinery repair and fabrication business that served the farms within 30 miles. He was good at it. He used his engineering training, and he used what he had learned in those boyhood summers, and he used what he continued to absorb from being near Harlan and the case in the years that followed. He did not explain to anyone in Omaha why he had left, and he did not explain to anyone in Kimball County why he had come back. The explanations he could have offered would not have captured it, and the people who needed no explanation were the people whose understanding mattered. When Harlan called on that Tuesday morning in April of 2007 and said he needed Owen to come out on Saturday to be shown some things about the machine. Owen understood what the call meant without it being stated. He had been expecting the call for 2 years in the way you expect a thing when you have watched someone approach it honestly and you know the person well enough to know they will not avoid it when it arrives. He drove out on Saturday morning. Harlan met him in the equipment yard, and they spent the morning going over every system of the case with a thoroughness that communicated without being stated that this was not a refresher or a courtesy, but a transfer. Harlan showed Owen the flue inspection procedure and the water glass reading and the safety valve test. He showed him the valve timing on both cylinders, guiding Owen's hand to the steam chest and explaining what correct felt like and what off felt like and why the difference between them mattered at working pressure. He showed him the cold firing sequence and the specific rate of pressure build that the boiler preferred and the signs that told you the rate was too fast. He showed him the winter shutdown and the spring inspection and the particular attention the crown sheet required and why it required it. The handover took 4 hours. It was the longest uninterrupted stretch of talking Harlan had done in years. Owen had his notebook open and was writing throughout, not to record information he could not otherwise remember, but because the act of writing was also a way of listening, a way of telling Harlan that what was being said was worth the effort of recording. When they were done, they sat on the equipment barn step with coffee. Owen's notebook was dense with detail. Harlan said, "Your grandfather Curtis bought her in 1933 when she was 12 years old. I have run her since 1944 when Curtis's heart made it necessary. That is 63 years she has been in my hands. She has given everything we ever asked of her and more besides." Owen said, "What do you want me to do with her?" Harlan said, "Use her. Do not let her sit. A machine that sits goes backward. She needs to run to stay right." Owen said he would use her, Harlan said, and keep the notebook. He meant the service notebook on the shelf above the workbench, the one he had been keeping since 1958, the one with 49 years of entries in his handwriting, covering every job the machine had done and every adjustment made and every repair and what was found and what was done and how the machine responded. Owen took it from the shelf and held it. Then Harlan said, "There is one more thing." Owen waited. Harlan told him about the night of July 20th, 1996. Not the version he had given at the bank after the recovery, which was the explanation of the method and the physics. He told Owen about 2 in the morning on the bank of Lander Creek, the rigging half done sitting on the platform of the case in the darkness, with the creek moving below and the rig at its angle in the water and 70 people planning to be on that bank in 5 hours. He said, "I sat there for 10 minutes without doing anything. I was not resting. I was sitting with a question I had not let myself ask before that moment, which was whether I was certain, whether the ground I had read that morning was the same kind of ground I had read in 1962 and 1974 and other jobs, or whether it was different in some way I had felt with my body, but not fully registered with my mind. Whether I was about to rig 36,000 pounds of load onto a system that I thought was right, but could not know was right, without the pull itself telling me." He said, "I sat there for 10 minutes, and I was not certain. I thought it would work. I did not know it would work. Those are different conditions, and I knew the difference between them." He said, "I got up and finished the rigging because the rigging was correct whether or not the pull would succeed, and leaving rigging half done in the dark is worse than leaving it not started. And because sitting there longer would not produce the certainty I was looking for, because the certainty I was looking for only exists on the other side of the work, not before it. You do the work that is in front of you. The outcome comes later." Owen said, "Why are you telling me this?" Harlan said, "Because the notebook does not have it. I wrote that the machine ran well. I did not write what happened before that. You should know that the man who ran her was not always certain. He just did the work anyway. That is what the machine requires of the man who runs it. Not certainty, just the work." Owen was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Is that what you want me to do?" Harlan said, "That is what the machine requires." Owen loaded the case onto a flatbed in the first week of May 2007. The county roads between Kimball and Keith County were not roads for a 4-mile-an-hour journey across that distance, and the case traveled by trailer rather than under its own power for the first time since Curtis brought it home from Aldous Greer's farm in 1933. Owen unloaded it in his equipment yard in Keith County and fired the boiler the following Saturday, cold start alone, following the procedure in the exact sequence Harlan had shown him, bringing the pressure up at the rate the boiler preferred. It sounded the way Harlan had said it would sound. It moved the way Harlan had said it would move. Owen started a second notebook. The first entry read, took custody from Uncle Harlan Saturday, May 5th, 2007. He showed me everything. I do not think I got half of it yet. Harlan Dern died on a February morning in 2012 at the age of 90. He had farmed some portion of the Dern land in Kimball County until 2009 when his legs made the field work impractical, and had spent the last 3 years in the farmhouse he had lived in since 1947. He died in the morning, which was the time of day he had always been most himself, the time when the light was arriving and the work was possible, and the day was still a set of things that could be done rather than a record of what had and had not been accomplished. The Kimball County paper ran a brief obituary. Lifelong farmer, familiar presence at the county fair, survived by his nephew Owen Dern of Keith County. The obituary did not mention Lander Creek because the reporter who wrote it did not know about Lander Creek. The people who knew about Lander Creek did not need an obituary to tell them anything. Maren Calloway called Owen the morning after Harlan died. She had been at the fence line in July of 1996, and she had watched Harlan wade into the creek, and she had heard the sound the crowd made when the rig came up the south bank. And she had known in the way that people who have watched a thing from the beginning know it, that what she was watching was the kind of thing that stays. She said he was right, there is a difference between knowing something will work and thinking it will work. He thought it would work, and then he did the work. She said it the way a woman says something she has been holding for 16 years and has now decided to say out loud. Owen said he knew. She said that is not nothing. That is actually everything. 3 days after Harlan died, Dale Pruitt called from Cheyenne. He had seen the death notice through a contact in Kimball County and wanted to say something to someone who had known Harlan well. He told Owen about the morning of July 21st, 1996, in the detail of a man telling a story he has carried carefully for a long time. He told Owen about standing on the bank, about the 2 minutes and 40 seconds of silence before the clay released, about the single word he had said quietly to himself when the rig first moved the word meant for no one and spoken to no one. Then he told Owen about Patricia Hendricks and the lateral recovery assessment addendum that had entered the company's field operations manual in January of 1997. He said the notation read, based on field observation, Kimball County, Nebraska, July 1996. He said that by 2001, lateral recovery assessment was standard in most major drilling operation protocols across the Central Plains and that Harlan's name appeared in none of it. Owen said he never knew that. Dale said, I know. I thought about telling him for 15 years and never did because I could not figure out what telling him would add to anything. The work was done. The principle was in the protocols. He did not seem like a man who needed to know his influence had spread. He seemed like a man who had already moved on to the next thing that needed doing. Owen said he would not have needed to know. He would have nodded and gone back to whatever he was working on. But I'm glad you told me. Dale said he was glad too. He said he thought someone who had been close to Harlan should know the full dimension of what that July morning had produced, even if Harlan himself never needed to hear it. They talked for another few minutes and then said goodbye, and Owen sat in his shop in Keith County for a while after the call ended, looking at the 2 notebooks on the shelf above his workbench, the thick one with Harlan's handwriting covering 49 years, and the thinner one with his own. The Case steam traction engine stands in Owen's equipment yard in Keith County now. Owen fires it twice a year for the county fair in August and for the Keith County Heritage Festival in September. It is the most attended display at both events, not because of its age, though it is now more than 100 years old, and not because of its history, though its history spans 3 generations of men who understood it in the specific way that men understand machines they have cared for long enough to know by feel rather than by specification. It is attended because Owen fires the boiler and runs the engine under load, and everyone who watches understands in the way that can only be understood by watching a working thing work, that this machine is not a museum piece. It is not a relic. It is a tool. It is ready. The service notebook that Harlan kept from 1958 to 2007 sits on the shelf in Owen's shop in Keith County. Beside it is the second notebook that Owen started in May of 2007, now thicker than when he began it, full of entries in his own handwriting that record every firing and every inspection and every adjustment and every job and what was found and what was done and how the machine responded. Between the two notebooks, there are more than 65 years of recorded attention, an unbroken chain of care for a single machine that spans the working lives of 2 men and reaches back through their memory to a third. The last entry in Harlan's notebook is dated October 14, 2006. It reads, "Winterized, all systems checked, valve packing on right steam chest renewed, machine ready for spring." He wrote that entry 9 months before he called Owen to come out on a Saturday morning. He did not know when he wrote it that it would be the last entry in his hand. He wrote it the way he had written every other entry, as an accurate record of work completed and condition noted, without sentiment and without drama, because sentiment and drama had never been what the notebook was for. The notebook was for accuracy. It was for the next man who would need to know what had been done and when and what had been found. The next man came. He is keeping the notebook correctly. Owen made his most recent entry on a Saturday morning the previous spring. It reads, "Fired for festival season, checked flues all clear, right admission valve slightly off adjusted to correct setting, boiler pressure held 138 to 141 throughout, machine ran well." The entry is in different handwriting from Harlan's, and the handwriting is in a different notebook, and the entry is 66 years after the first entry in Harlan's notebook, and almost everything about the 2 men and their 2 lives is different. But the last 3 words are exactly the same. Machine ran well. Now let me ask you something, because this story points toward a question that is worth asking honestly. When was the last time you looked at a problem that seemed intractable and asked first whether you were asking the right question? Not whether you had the right tools, not whether you had enough power or enough capacity or enough modern equipment, whether the question itself was the right one. 2 crane companies looked at a 55-ton rig in a Nebraska creek and calculated the crane required to lift it, and concluded the ground would not support that crane, and wrote a report saying recovery was not feasible. They were answering the question their training had given them to answer. They were answering it correctly. The ground would not support the crane they calculated. Every number in the report was right. Harlan Dern looked at the same rig and asked a different question. Not how much force to lift it, how much force to start it moving, and how long you had to hold that force before the clay gave way. The answer to that question was 36,000 pounds for 27 minutes, delivered by a machine that produced its maximum torque at 0 revolutions per minute, that grew stronger as the load grew heavier, that could hold a pull as long as the boiler had water in it, which was as long as the job required. The question the engineers answered was not a bad question. It was the question their framework gave them. The problem was that the framework they brought to the problem was not the framework the problem needed. The framework that the problem needed was the one Harlan Dern had been building for 63 years, through every difficult load and every impossible job and every morning in the shop, behind the equipment barn with his hands on fittings that told him what measuring instruments could not. That is the thing about knowledge that lives in the hands. It cannot be stored in a manual or transmitted in a seminar or obtained through any credential. It is built by doing the work over time past the point where the work feels like learning and into the territory where the work and the man doing it become a single thing that operates as one. Harlan Dern and the case were one thing by 1996. That one thing asked the question that the problem required. The Lander Creek Ford still carries county road traffic through the shallow water in summer and the dry crossing in winter the same way it has for a century. The gravel bar on the south side is still there, still the same composition of natural gravel that held the steel tracks of a 75-year-old machine on the morning of July 21st, 1996. Drivers crossed the ford without knowing what happened there. The creek does not hold the record of it. But in Kimball County and Keith County, among the farmers who were on that bank and their children who heard about it from them, the morning is still present, not as history, as instruction. And in the drilling operation protocols of companies across the Central Plains, in the section titled Lateral Recovery Assessment, in the notation that reads, based on field observation, Kimball County, Nebraska, July 1996. The morning is present there too, without a name, without a face, without any indication of the machine or the man who demonstrated what the notation describes. Harlan Dern never needed to be in the manual. The principle he demonstrated was in the manual. That was the outcome he would have chosen if anyone had asked him, which no one did, because he had not been the kind of man who required asking about such things. He had been the kind of man who did the work and then went home and made his supper and wrote in his notebook and went to bed and got up in the morning when the light came and did the next thing that needed doing. The case is running in Keith County. It does not make promises before the work. It does not explain in advance what it will do. It builds pressure at the rate the boiler prefers, and when the throttle opens, it delivers what it has always delivered, which is force without urgency and power without hurry. The specific and patient kind of strength that does not come from speed, but from the refusal to stop. In more than 100 years of recorded work, the boiler has never run dry. Steam does not care how long it takes, it just pushes.